The poor cowboy had risked his life to save two Apache sisters. What he didn't yet know was that their chief's decision would change his fate forever. The blood covering his hands wasn't his, and that unsettled him more than the pain itself. Keen Draven stood beside the massive body of the mountain lion, motionless, barely breathing. The cat's lifeless golden eyes stared into nothing, as if it couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Its claws were still wet, warm, thick with death, and yet the two women who had witnessed everything from behind didn't scream, didn't tremble, didn't run. They simply watched him in silence, with a stillness that chilled the air, as though they had been waiting for this very moment. Keen's shirt hung in tatters. 3 deep gashes crossed his chest, bleeding steadily with a rhythmic pulse. Next to him lay the improvised spear, a broken fence post with a rusty nail, now bent and useless. Any sane man would have fled. Anyone else would have run, except him, because Keen Draven had done something senseless. He had fought a mountain lion with his bare hands. Then, the older sister stepped forward. Her dark eyes scanned him like a blade, sharp and unyielding, until Keen had to look away. She spoke something in Apache to her younger sister, who nodded slowly without breaking eye contact. Then, the elder turned back to Keen and said a sentence he would never forget. "The chief has been waiting for you, waiting for him, as if they'd known about him all along, as if the attack, the place, the timing, had all been foretold." Keen had never met an Apache chief. He'd never spoken to anyone from their people. But these women treated him like they knew exactly who he was. The younger sister knelt and picked something up from the dirt, right beside the mountain lion's body. It was a small carved bone, stained with the animal's blood. She held it up to the light, and Keen saw etched symbols, lines and strange markings. He didn't recognize that script. He'd never seen anything like it before. "It was inside the animal," the young woman said in perfect English, her voice calm but firm. Keen stared at her in disbelief. A message inside an animal? Cougars didn't carry bones. Wild beasts didn't hide carved symbols. And yet, there it was. The bone. Throbbing with presence. Real. A living piece of proof that everything he thought he knew about this day was deeply wrong. The older sister stepped closer, and with steady fingers, touched his wounded chest. She traced the claw marks gently, with a reverence that felt almost ritual. 3 cuts, she whispered, just as the prophecy said. Prophecy? What were they talking about? Why did Keen suddenly feel like he had crossed into something far beyond himself? Like none of this had truly started with the lion's roar, but much earlier. His legs began to tremble as the adrenaline wore off. All that remained was the searing burn across his chest. The 3 slashes stretched from shoulder to ribs, deep enough to need stitches. His shirt, soaked in blood, dripped steadily onto the dry earth. "We have to stop the bleeding," the older woman said clearly as she moved closer. She walked like someone who had healed wounds her whole life, without hesitation, without fear. "I'm Vela Thorne," she said, opening a leather pouch filled with clean strips. "And this is my sister, Noma Thorne." Noma lifted the bone again, turning it slowly between her fingers with quiet focus. "It was under the lion's body," she explained. "It must have fallen when the animal collapsed. That made more sense. The bone hadn't been inside the beast. Someone had placed it there, not long ago." As the shock faded, Keen's mind started working again. Logic began to return. But nothing he had lived through that day made any sense, and that unsettled him more than any claw or wound. The bone hadn't come from within the animal. It had simply gotten pinned under the body when the cougar fell dead. Someone had planted it there recently. Noma kept studying the markings carefully. "They're territorial symbols," she said, looking up. "Someone's claiming this land." Vela pulled a small leather pouch from her belt and began taking out clean strips of cloth. "You saved our lives," she said bluntly. "We were out gathering medicinal plants when the animal attacked. You didn't have to risk yourself for strangers." Keen let out a groan as she began cleaning the wounds. The pain was sharp, but bearable. "I couldn't just stand by," he murmured. "Most would have," Vela replied. "That's why our chief values men like you." "Your chief doesn't know me," Keen said, confused. The sisters exchanged a silent glance. Noma tucked the carved bone into her pouch and stepped closer. "Does he know who you are, Keen Draven?" "Word travels fast about the man trying to keep that dry patch of land alive down south." "How did they know his name?" Keen had lived alone on his ranch for 3 years, barely keeping a few head of cattle alive. He hardly spoke to anyone, let alone Apache families. "The drought hit everyone," Vela continued as she worked. "Your neighbors gave up and left. But not you. You kept working a land everyone else had written off." Noma nodded. "Chief Orlan Crow respects perseverance, especially when it's rooted in the right reasons." Keen swallowed hard. "And what would your chief want with a failed rancher?" The question carried the weight of 3 years of frustration, of watching his dreams wither under an unforgiving sun. Vela finished wrapping his chest with care and stepped back. "Who says you failed?" Keen hadn't found an answer when Noma lifted her hand and pointed towards the horizon. "Someone's coming." A small group of riders was approaching, kicking up a soft cloud of dust behind them. Even from that distance, Keen could tell they rode in formation, with discipline and purpose. As they drew nearer, he counted 6 men on horseback, dressed in tanned leather with long hair flowing. Clear signs they were Apache. "That's our brother," Vela said calmly. "He's coming with his men. They were tracking the same animal that attacked us." Keen's stomach tightened. He had just killed a mountain lion, on what could very well be Apache land. He didn't know if he had just interfered with something sacred or broken some territorial agreement he didn't understand. "Will there be trouble?" he asked quietly. Noma gave her first smile since the attack. "That depends entirely on how you answer their questions." The riders were close enough now that he could make out their faces. The man leading them rode tall in the saddle, firm, imposing, his dark eyes locked onto the scene before him. A dead mountain lion, 2 Apache women, and a bloodied rancher standing in the middle of it all. "Remember," Vela said under her breath, "answer with honesty. Chief Orlan Crow values truth above all." But as the riders drew nearer, Keen realized he had no idea what they'd ask, or whether telling the truth would be enough to keep him alive. The lead rider dismounted with silent grace. His boots touched the ground without a sound. He stood nearly a head taller than Keen, broad-shouldered with scars that told of many battles. Still, it was his eyes that commanded respect, sharp, alert, reading every detail. "Vela Thorn, Noma Thorn," he said in a voice that blended authority with relief. We heard screams. "This man saved us," Vela replied, and Brigg answered with what Keen assumed was a respectful title. The animal had Noma pinned against the rocks. The man they called Brigg Halden circled the lion's body slowly, examining the wounds. 3 deep punctures in its neck marked where Keen's makeshift spear had struck. The claw marks in the dirt revealed the violence of the struggle. Blood splatters told the story of a desperate fight. "You killed it alone?" Brigg asked, now fixing his full attention on Keen. "Yes," Keen replied, holding the man's gaze despite the tension. "With what weapon?" Keen pointed to the broken fence post lying on the ground. "With that, and my hands when it snapped." One of the other men muttered something in Apache, but Brigg silenced him with a sharp gesture. "Show me your hands," he ordered. Keen held out his arms. His knuckles were cracked and swollen, his palms torn from the rough wood. Deep scratches marked his forearms, clear evidence of the animal's claws. Brigg examined the wounds closely, then looked back at the dead lion. Mountain lions don't attack during the day, unless they're desperate or defending territory. Noma pulled out the carved bone. "We found this under its body. Someone's marking this area." Brigg took the bone and studied the etched symbols. His expression darkened. "These markings aren't Apache." "Then whose are they?" Vela asked. "Varn Mercer," Brigg said grimly. "They've been pushing closer to our borders for months. This bone is a land claim marker." A chill ran through Keen despite the heat of the afternoon. He knew men like that all too well, ruthless land grabbers who saw Apache land as something they could take by force. They used intimidation, violence, and worse to remove anyone in their way. "The lion wasn't hunting," Brigg went on. "She was defending her cubs. Someone drove her from her den, pushed her into unfamiliar territory, until she turned dangerous." The pieces began to fall into place. Keen had heard stories of ranchers forcing predators toward Apache settlements to stir conflict and justify military intervention. "You said the chief knows about me," Keen said cautiously. "What exactly does he know?" Brigg studied him for a long moment. "He knows you turned down 3 offers to sell your land to the same men who left this mark. He knows you shared water from your well with Apache families during the drought, even when your own cattle were dying of thirst." Keen was stunned. He never imagined that anyone had noticed those small gestures, let alone the Apache chief. "He also knows," Brigg added, "that you're running out of time." "What do you mean?" "The ranchers who want your land don't take no for an answer. When they can't buy what they want, they find other ways to take it." Vela stepped forward, concern etched on her face. "That's why we were really out here today. We weren't just gathering herbs. We were watching for signs of trouble, watching over your land." Keen looked up, surprised. "My land?" "Protecting it," Noma corrected firmly. "Our chief sent us to observe what was happening while he decided what to do about you." Keen frowned. "What to do about me?" Brigg mounted his horse again and looked down, sizing Keen up with a calm gaze. "Chief Orlin Crow has been watching you for months. He wanted to know what kind of man you really are," Brigg said, pausing briefly. "Today, you gave him your answer." The group began to move. Vela and Noma mounted the horses that 2 of the men had brought for them. Still, no one rode off just yet. They waited. "You coming?" Brigg asked. "Where to?" Keen replied. "To meet the chief. He's been waiting to speak with you." Keen glanced toward his small ranch in the distance, then at the dead lion, and finally at the carved bone, a symbol of a threat he was only beginning to understand. He swallowed hard. "And if I say no?" Brigg's expression hardened. "Then go back to your ranch alone, and whatever happens next will happen without our protection." The choice was clear, even if the consequences weren't. Chief Orlin Crow wanted to meet the man who had risked everything to save 2 Apache sisters. The real question was whether that meeting would seal Keen Draven's fate, or mark the beginning of something entirely different. Keen climbed onto the spare horse they offered him, stifling a groan as the movement pulled at the bandages on his chest. The animal was well trained and responded to his touch with surprising calm. As they rode away from the scene, Keene couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving his old life behind. The Apache settlement lay hidden in a valley surrounded by towering red rock formations that rose like ancient walls. Keene had passed near that area many times without ever noticing a single sign of life. Now he understood why. The village was completely concealed from the outside, visible only to those who knew exactly where to look. "How long has your people lived here?" Keene asked Vela as they descended into the valley. "3 generations," she replied. "My grandfather chose this place because it has everything we need: water, shelter, hunting grounds, and most of all, protection from those who want to drive us out." The settlement held around 30 dwellings, a mix of traditional Apache structures and sturdier buildings adapted for long-term living. Children played in the center while women worked at various tasks. At the far end of the valley, men tended horses in a large corral. What struck Keene most was the sense of purposeful activity. This wasn't a temporary camp. It was a thriving, living community that had learned to blend tradition with practical survival. "Chief Orland Crow is waiting for you by the council fire," Briggs said, pointing toward a spot where a steady column of smoke rose. As they approached, Keene saw an older man seated in a simple wooden chair, weathered hands resting on his lap. Chief Orland Crow looked to be in his 60s. His hair was graying, and his eyes seemed to take in everything without judgment. He wore simple clothing: leather pants, a cotton shirt, and an embroidered vest that signaled authority without show. "Welcome, Keene Draven," the chief said clearly as Keene dismounted. "Please, sit down." Keene took the seat across from him, aware that several members of the tribe were watching from a respectful distance. "My daughters tell me you fought a mountain lion with your bare hands to save them," Chief Orland began. "I used a fence post first," Keene clarified. "My hands were the last resort when it broke." The chief nodded slowly. "Honesty? Good. Tell me, what do you know about the men who want your land?" "Only that they made 3 offers to buy it," Keene answered, "each one higher than the last. When I turned down the 3rd, their man said they wouldn't ask again. Do you know why they want that particular patch?" Keene shook his head. "It's not good land for cattle. Too dry, too rocky. I've barely kept a dozen head alive." Chief Orland Crow leaned forward slightly. "Your land sits on the most direct route between their eastern holdings and the territory they intend to claim here. Without it, they'd have to circle the mesas and lose at least 2 days' travel." Then it became clear Keene Draven's ranch wasn't valuable for what it produced, but for where it stood. "They'll take it one way or another," the chief continued. "Men like that don't tolerate obstacles. They'll invent charges. Say you're harboring criminals, that your cattle are diseased, or that you violated some territorial law, they'll draft themselves." "Then why haven't they done it already?" Keene asked. "Because taking land from a white rancher requires justification to the authorities. Taking it from Apache families doesn't require anything at all." The brutal honesty of those words hit Keene like a punch. He began to understand why Chief Orland Crow had been watching him, judging him silently. "You could sell," the chief suggested. "Take their money and start over somewhere else." "I could," Keene admitted, "but I won't." "Why not?" Keene thought before answering. "Because it wouldn't be right, and because once men like that learn they can scare you off, they never stop." The chief studied him for a long moment, then stood and walked slowly toward the council fire. He picked up a stick from the edge of the flames and began drawing lines in the dirt before them, sketching a rough map of the surrounding territory. "These are their lands," he said, marking the zones to the east. Then he added more lines and arrows. "And this is the expansion they plan." The arrows moved directly into Apache territory. Finally, he drew a small square right in the middle of the path. "And here is your land." The image made the situation unmistakably clear. Keene Draven's ranch was like a cork in a bottle. The ranchers were desperate to remove it to open the flow to everything else. "What happens if I stay and fight?" Keene asked. "They'll destroy you," the chief answered bluntly. "One man alone stands no chance against their power." The number of people gathered around the fire had grown. Keene noticed they were listening to every word with full attention. This wasn't just an informal talk anymore. It was a judgment. Chief Orlin Crow continued. "One man alone changes nothing. One man fighting alongside others, that changes everything." The thought hung in the air, like the smoke above the council fire. Keene realized then that everything that had happened that day, the attack, the rescue, even this meeting, had led to this moment. The chief erased the markings in the dirt with his boot and returned to his seat. Members of the tribe stepped in closer, forming an open circle around the fire. Keene sensed this was no longer just a conversation. It was a formal act. "For 3 months I've watched you," the chief began, in a voice meant for all to hear. "You shared the water from your well when your own cattle were dying. You helped mend the fence that keeps our horses from wandering, and took nothing in return. You've shown respect for our boundaries, and for our way of life." A murmur of approval passed through the circle. Keene hadn't imagined that so many of his small actions had been seen and remembered. "Today," the chief continued, "you risked your life for my daughters without hesitation, without seeking reward or recognition. You fought a mountain lion with nothing but courage and grit." Chief Orlin stood once more and walked over to a wooden chest beside his chair. From it, he took out a leather case, worn with age but well cared for. "The ranchers threatening you are also threatening us," he said. "They want to drive us from this valley, take our water, and force us onto a reservation, dependent on government rations that always arrive late and in poor condition." He opened the case and pulled out several documents bearing official seals. "But there's something they're not expecting. We hold legal title to these lands. It was granted by the territorial government 15 years ago, in exchange for our service as scouts during the wars." Keene stared at the documents in disbelief. Legal land ownership by Apache families was rare, almost unheard of in that region. "They think we're squatters they can remove at will," Chief Orlin Crow explained. "They're wrong. But the law means nothing if we can't defend what's rightfully ours." He carefully put the papers away and closed the case. "Your land, though small, controls the only practical route for moving large herds through this region. Without it, their plans become slower and more expensive." Keene took a deep breath. "What are you proposing?" he asked, though part of him already knew. "An alliance," the chief replied. "You continue working your ranch, under our protection. In return, you help us defend this valley from those who want to steal it from us." The offer was more generous than anything Keene had dared to imagine, but he felt something was still missing. "What kind of help?" The chief motioned, and one of the men stepped forward holding a rifle in his hands. It was a more modern weapon than anything Keene had ever owned. "Do you know how to shoot?" the chief asked. "Yes," Keene replied, "but those ranchers won't come alone. They'll bring gunmen, mercenaries without law or conscience. That's why we need fighters who understand both Apache tactics and the mind of the white man." Keene looked around at the faces surrounding him. They were offering him something he'd never had before: belonging, purpose, protection. But they were also asking him to be willing to fight and to kill, to defend it. Then the chief added, "There's something else, something that makes this alliance even more urgent." He nodded to Noma, who stepped forward holding the carved bone they had found earlier. "We sent riders to investigate its origin," she said. "What they discovered changes everything." "The ranchers aren't just marking territory," added another man with a grim tone. "They're building a settlement about 10 kilometers to the east, an armed compound, supply depots, housing for dozens of men." The weight of those words fell heavily on Keene. This wasn't just a land dispute anymore. It was a planned, near-military occupation of the entire region. "How long before they move in?" he asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3, Chief Orlan answered. "They're waiting for reinforcements from Texas and legal papers they believe will give them authority to remove us." Keen felt the decision settle on his shoulders. Accepting the alliance meant committing to a fight that could cost him his life. Refusing it would leave him alone against those men, while watching this community lose everything they had built. "If I say yes," Keen said slowly, "what exactly is expected of me?" Chief Orlan Crow gave his first smile since Keen had arrived in the valley. "First, you'll move your cattle into this protected valley," the chief explained calmly. "Here, they'll have clean water and rich grazing, far better than what they've known in years." That offer alone was enough to make Keen seriously consider it. His animals were barely surviving on the drought-stricken land he called a ranch. "Second," the chief continued, "you'll help us prepare the defenses for when the ranchers arrive. Your knowledge of their tactics and their weapons will be invaluable." Then the chief's tone grew heavier. "And third, when the fighting starts, you'll stand with us, not as a hired gun, but as family." Family. That word hit harder than any legal deed or military alliance. They weren't just offering protection, they were offering belonging. Before Keen could reply, a young rider burst into the valley at full gallop. The horse was lathered with sweat, and the boy's face was tight with urgency. "Chief!" he shouted, leaping down from his saddle. "Armed men are approaching Keen's ranch, at least a dozen heavily armed." The time to decide had come sooner than expected. Keen understood now that his choice wouldn't be made by the council fire, but in the heart of an immediate crisis. He didn't hesitate. "I accept the alliance," he said, rising to his feet, "but we need to move now." Chief Orlan Crow nodded with approval. "Brig, gather 12 of our best riders," he ordered. Then he turned to Keen. "You'll lead us to your ranch. Take the fastest way." Within minutes, the peaceful valley turned into a storm of purposeful motion. Warriors rushed from their homes with rifles and ammunition. Horses were saddled with swift, quiet precision. The women gathered supplies and prepared for the wounded who might return. Vela approached Keen and handed him a rifle, better than the one Brig had shown him earlier. "It belonged to my husband," she said softly. "He'd want it used to protect family." That word again, family, landed hard in Keen's chest. These people had just accepted him as one of their own, and now they were preparing to risk their lives for his dying ranch and his scattered cattle. As they mounted up, Keen turned to Chief Orlan. "Even if we drive them off today, my stock won't last another week without water." "Then we'll bring them here with us," the chief answered, without hesitation. That very night, as they rode out of the valley, Keen felt a strange mix of loss and hope. He was leaving behind the solitary life he'd led for 3 years, but gaining something he never dared to imagine, a place to belong. The ride to his ranch took just under an hour, pushing fast across terrain Keen had ridden 100 times alone. Now, he rode with a new purpose, surrounded by men who had chosen to fight at his side. As they crested the final hill overlooking his property, the sight froze Keen's blood. Columns of smoke were rising from multiple points around his small homestead. The barn was engulfed in flames. The cabin's windows were shattered, part of the roof caved in. Brig pointed toward a group of riders gathered near the ruins of the corral. 15 men, all armed with rifles. Keen saw his cattle scattered across the land. Some animals lay motionless. They had slaughtered livestock for sport, torn down his buildings to send a message, and now they waited for him to see it. "They want you to witness this," Chief Orlan observed. "It's a message for anyone who refuses their offers." One of the men below spotted them on the ridge. Shouts rang out as the attackers formed a defensive line. "What's the plan?" Keen asked, checking the rifle in his hands. The chief studied the terrain with a strategist's eye. "They chose their spot poorly. They've got good sight lines on the approach, but no cover against a flanking assault." He gestured and gave rapid orders in Apache. Immediately, half the warriors split off, circling wide to the east, while the rest prepared to charge straight ahead. "We're not trying to kill them all," the chief explained to Keen. "We want a few to get away, to carry a message." What message? That Keen Draven is no longer alone. The attack was swift and overwhelming. While the main group descended the slope in a frontal assault, the eastern flank opened fire from the ridge. Trapped between two forces, the ranchers' hired guns were caught off guard and fell into disarray. The fight lasted less than 10 minutes. When the shooting stopped, 5 attackers lay wounded. The rest had fled, abandoning both their comrades and their supplies. Keen looked out at the ruins of his property with mixed emotions. Everything he'd built over 3 years was now in ashes. And yet, he felt more hope than he had in a long time. "Your cattle!" Noma shouted, galloping up from the eastern pasture. "7 survived!" The rest, Noma motioned toward the scattered bodies, had fallen where they stood. 7 animals from the 12 Keen had struggled for years to keep alive. It should have been devastating. And yet, Keen felt something unexpected. Relief. 7 head of cattle were enough to start over, especially now that he had support, protection, and a safe place to rebuild. Chief Orlin Crow approached one of the wounded men, a boy barely out of his teens, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "Tell your employers," the chief said loud and firm, "that this land now belongs to the Apache Nation and Keen Draven together. Any new invasion will be treated as an act of war." The boy nodded frantically, eager to keep his life. "And tell them also," Keen added, surprised at the authority in his own voice, "that the route through this territory is now permanently closed to their operations." As they prepared to leave with the surviving cattle, Keen cast one last glance at the remnants of his old life. The cabin where he'd lived alone, the barn that stored his meager supplies, the corral where he had tended his weary animals, all reduced to smoke, ash, and memory. But as he rode back toward the Apache Valley, he understood that Chief Orlin Crow's decision to accept him as family had already begun to change his fate. He was no longer a poor rancher fighting a losing battle alone. He was now part of something larger, something worth defending, something that would outlast the threats of the ranchers. The Apache Valley looked different upon returning. Where once Keen had seen a hidden settlement, now he saw a home. Sheltered pastures, clear water, and a strong sense of community. Everything his isolated ranch had never offered now surrounded him in abundance. His 7 surviving cattle, thin and still jittery from the day's chaos, headed straight for the stream. For the first time in months, Keen watched them drink freely. No need to ration water for the days ahead. "They'll recover fast here," Vela observed, approaching near the corral. "Good grass, clean water, and protection from predators and from men," Keen added, still grasping the full weight of what had unfolded. Chief Orlin Crow stepped forward, carrying the leather case he'd shown earlier. "There's something we must discuss," he said, "the legal aspect of our alliance." They walked toward the council fire area, where several elders were already waiting. Keen immediately recognized the formality of the moment. This was official business. "The ranchers won't stop just because we defeated their gunmen today," the chief began. "They'll file legal claims, accuse us of harboring criminals, demand military intervention." He opened the case and spread several documents across a flat stone. "But there's a way to protect both you and our people." Keen studied the papers. Land titles, water rights, territorial agreements, all stamped and signed with official seals. You can become a legal partner in our lands, Chief Orland Crow explained. Your name alongside ours, your cattle registered as part of our operations, your residence officially established within our territory. And what would that mean? Keene asked. One of the elders, a man with sharp eyes and a calm voice, leaned forward. It would mean that any attack on you would be considered an attack on legally recognized Apache property. The territorial government would be obligated to investigate and prosecute. The weight of it all was immense. Keene would no longer be an isolated target, but part of a community protected by law. But there's more, Chief Orland continued. We need someone who understands both Apache culture and the ways of white men, someone who can represent us in courtrooms and government offices. Keene looked at the chief, surprised. You're offering me a position of authority? We're offering you a future, Vela said simply. One where your knowledge and your courage serve something more than just surviving. Before Keene could respond, the sound of hooves echoed at the valley's entrance. A scout galloped in and dismounted near the council fire. Chief, he reported urgently, the ranchers have sent riders to Fort Brennan. They're claiming that Apache raiders attacked their peaceful survey crew and stole cattle. The twisted version of events didn't surprise Keene, though the boldness of it chilled him. They had burned his property, slaughtered his animals, and now they were playing the victims. How long until the soldiers arrive? Asked Chief Orland. 2 days, maybe 3, the scout replied. Depends how many men the fort's commander decides to send. The chief stood, his expression severe yet composed. Then we have time to prepare a proper legal defense. He turned to Keene. This is your final moment to choose. Accept this partnership and fight alongside us in courts and councils, or leave now before the soldiers arrive and try to start over somewhere else. Keene looked around the circle of faces. People who had taken him in, protected him, and offered something he'd never thought possible. The decision wasn't hard. I accept, he said firmly. But I want to understand exactly what we're fighting for, he added, eyes steady on the chief. Chief Orland Crow gave a faint smile and gestured to the valley surrounding them. We're fighting for the right to live in peace on land that is legally ours, for the right to defend ourselves against men who use violence and lies to take what they want, and for the principle that justice should protect those who follow the law, not those who trample it. The elder who had spoken before slowly brought out a quill and ink. Then we must make it official before the soldiers arrive. As Keene signed the partnership documents, he felt the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders like a mantle of responsibility. 3 days ago, he'd been a failed rancher, with no allies, no future, and no hope. Now he was a legal partner in a thriving community, surrounded by people who called him family, and with a purpose far greater than mere survival. Still, as the sun dipped behind the valley's edge, Keene knew the hardest days were yet to come. The ranchers wouldn't accept defeat easily, and the arrival of federal troops would test everything they'd built. What will happen when the soldiers arrive? Keene asked Chief Orland. That depends on whether they come seeking justice or simply looking for an excuse to force us out, the chief replied. Either way, we'll be ready. As Keene looked into the fire-lit faces, resolute and unflinching, he believed it. Chief Orland Crow's decision to call him family had already changed his fate in a way that couldn't be undone. Now it remained to be seen if that change would endure, or if the forces rising against them would prove too strong. 2 days later, the sound of hooves thundered through the valley. Keene stood beside Chief Orland at the entrance, watching as a column of 8 federal soldiers rode in formation. At the front rode a captain, his weathered face bearing the marks of years on the frontier. Captain Flint Marwood, said Chief Orland, recognizing him. Welcome to our territory. The captain dismounted, resting his hand casually on his sidearm. Chief Crow, I'm here to investigate reports of Apache attacks on civilian surveyors. We're also searching for stolen cattle, and a white rancher by the name of Keen Draven. I'm Keen Draven, he said, stepping forward and extending his hand. And I haven't been missing. I've been here conducting lawful business with my Apache partners. The captain's eyes narrowed as he assessed Keen's appearance. Clean clothes, well-fed, no signs of injury or coercion. This wasn't what he had expected to find. The ranchers who filed the complaint claimed you were taken against your will after the attack on your ranch, Marwood said cautiously. Keen let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Captain, my ranch was attacked, yes, but not by Apache raiders. It was set ablaze by hired gunmen working for the same ranchers who are now playing the victim. Chief Orland stepped forward with the leather case in hand. Captain, before we discuss any accusations, perhaps you should examine the legal documentation governing this territory. Marwood opened the case and studied the property deeds, water rights, and territorial agreements. Keen watched as the captain's expression shifted upon recognizing legitimate federal documents. These lands are legally owned by the Apache Nation under territorial authority, the chief explained. Mr. Draven is now a registered partner in our operations, with all the legal protections that implies. That may be, Marwood said slowly, but there are still reports of stolen cattle and assaults on civilian surveyors. Keen pulled a folded paper from the pocket of his vest. Captain, this contains the names and descriptions of the men who attacked my property. The events were witnessed by me and several Apache citizens. We're prepared to file formal charges for arson, destruction of property, and theft. One of Marwood's sergeants leaned in and whispered something to him. The captain nodded, his expression serious. The men you describe match known associates of the Creed and Holland customers, Marwood admitted. We've received prior complaints about their methods. Chief Orland Crow gestured toward the valley. Captain, you and your men are welcome to inspect our settlement, count our livestock, and speak to anyone you wish. You'll find no stolen goods and no evidence of raids. Marwood accepted the invitation and spent the next 2 hours conducting a thorough investigation. What he found was a law-abiding community, well organized, with detailed records of livestock and property. Mr. Draven, the captain said upon completing the inspection, your cattle, those that survived the attack on your ranch, are here legally. 7 head, Keen confirmed, all bearing my brand and properly recorded in the territorial registry. I can provide testimony on how they arrived here. Marwood turned to his men. Sergeant, what did you find during the interviews? Consistent accounts, sir, the sergeant replied. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Mr. Draven's ranch was attacked by armed men who burned his buildings and killed his livestock. Apache families offered him aid and protection. Captain Flint Marwood surveyed the scene. Peaceful families, productive work, clear signs of order and prosperity. This wasn't a raiders' camp or a criminal operation. Chief Crow, Marwood said formally, based on my investigation, I find no evidence to support the accusations brought against your people. In fact, the evidence suggests crimes were committed against Mr. Draven and his community. Then he turned to Keen. Mr. Draven, I will file a report recommending that territorial authorities investigate Creed and Holland cumbers for criminal activities. You may be asked to testify. I'll be ready, Keen replied with conviction. As the soldiers prepared to depart, Captain Marwood pulled Keen aside a few steps. Son, you know this doesn't end here, right? Creed and Holland has money and political pull. They'll find other ways to come after you. Keen looked out over the valley, at the people who were now his family, at the life he was building with meaning and purpose. Captain, 3 days ago I was alone. No money, no protection, completely exposed to men like that. Today I have legal backing, the support of a community, and a role that truly matters. If they want to keep fighting, they'll find everything has changed." Marwood nodded in approval. "Well said. Just stay alert." As the soldiers rode off, Keene felt a deep sense of closure. The legal threat had been neutralized. His partnership was now officially recognized by federal authority, and the rancher's lies had been publicly exposed. But more importantly, he had proven, to himself and to everyone else, that Chief Orlin Crow's decision to accept him had built something lasting and unshakable. His transformation from an isolated failure to a respected leader within a thriving community was now solidified both legally and socially, beyond all doubt. 3 months later, Keene Draven stood in the territorial courthouse of the county capital, dressed in a clean suit and carrying documents that represented not just his own interests, but those of an entire community. The hearing to formally recognize the expansion of the Apache Nation's water rights was the result of weeks of legal preparation. "Mr. Draven," said Judge Thorne Maddox, "are you representing the Apache Nation in this matter?" "Yes, Your Honor," Keene replied, as their officially designated legal representative and business partner. The transformation was complete in a way he never could have imagined. Where once he had struggled just to keep a dozen starving cattle alive, now he oversaw thriving herds numbering in the hundreds. Where once he woke each morning wondering if he'd survive another week, now he planned confidently in terms of months and years. The Apache Valley had become a model of prosperous cooperation between cultures. Keene's knowledge of territorial law and commerce, combined with Apache wisdom in land management and water conservation, had created something entirely new in the region. "The court grants the Apache Nation's petition for the expansion of water rights," the judge announced after reviewing the documents. "The legal partnership with Mr. Draven's cattle operations provides clear justification under territorial law." Outside the courthouse, Chief Orlin Crow waited alongside Vela and Noma. The sisters had become more than friends. They were true family, often consulting with Keene on matters bridging the Apache and non-Apache worlds. "How did it go?" Vela asked. "Total victory," Keene replied, unable to hide his satisfaction. "Water rights fully recognized, territorial boundaries upheld, and a legal precedent established for other Apache communities." Chief Orlin nodded with quiet approval. "Your people will benefit from this as much as ours. Legal access to water means stability for the whole region." As they prepared for the journey home, a familiar figure approached from across the street. Captain Flint Marwood, now in civilian clothes, walked toward them with steady purpose. "Mr. Draven, Chief Crow," he said, tipping his hat respectfully. "I wanted to inform you that the investigation into Creed and Holland Cummins concluded yesterday." "And?" Keene asked. "Federal charges for conspiracy, arson, and attempted territorial land seizure. 3 of their men are already in custody, and the company's territorial licenses have been revoked." Justice had been served, but more importantly, the legal victory established lasting protection, long after the individual criminals would be forgotten. "Anything else?" Marwood continued. "The territorial governor asked me to extend an invitation. He'd like to meet with you both to discuss forming a formal mediation service for land disputes involving Apache communities." The proposal represented recognition at the highest level of government, a confirmation that the alliance between Keene and Chief Orlin Crow had created something valuable and permanent. The ride back to the valley took them past the land where Keene's old ranch had once stood. The cabin and barn were gone. In their place, new grass had begun to grow. The old corral had been taken down, its timber reused in the construction of buildings in the Apache settlement. Keene felt no sorrow for what was lost. That solitary, uncertain life felt like it belonged to another man entirely. "Do you ever regret it?" Noma asked, following his gaze across the empty land. Giving up your independence to become part of our community?" Keen paused, considering her words. "I thought I was independent before," he said at last, "but I was just alone. Real independence comes from being strong enough to help others, and from having people you can lean on when you need it." As they crested the hill overlooking the Apache Valley, Keen saw the community thriving below. Children played in the center while adults worked. The large corral held dozens of healthy cattle. His original 7 had multiplied under proper care, and now formed the foundation of a growing herd. And more than anything, he saw home. Not just a place to survive, but a place where he belonged, where his skills and knowledge mattered, where he could build something that would last. Chief Orland Crow's decision changed everything, Keen murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "It was the right decision," the chief answered simply. "A man willing to risk his life for others without expecting reward is the same man who will fight just as fiercely to protect what he loves." As they rode down into the valley, Keen understood with perfect clarity that the poor rancher who once fought a mountain lion to save 2 Apache sisters no longer existed. That man had been left behind forever. In his place stood a respected leader, a legal advocate, and most of all, a proud member of a family that reached far beyond blood. A family built on trust, shared sacrifice, and mutual loyalty. Chief Crow's decision had changed his destiny permanently, not by magic or luck, but by something far more powerful: the recognition that courage and honor, when supported and directed with purpose, can transform not just a man's life, but the fate of an entire community. The setting sun bathed the valley in golden light, casting long shadows across the fertile land and revealing a future filled with meaning and prosperity. Keen rode on with the unshakable certainty that he would never face the world alone again. He had found a place where he belonged, a cause worth defending, and people who would fight beside him.